All right, whenever you're ready, Carl. Thank you.
Great. Have I successfully shared my screen?
You have.
Good. Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending this webinar. My name is Carl Hausker. I'm a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute in the Climate Program. WRI is a green think tank based in DC and works on all aspects of sustainability: climate, energy, water, food, cities, oceans, lots of sustainability challenges. And of course, climate is an overarching challenge that affects all aspects of sustainability. I'm going to talk to you today about getting to net zero emissions, pathways to a safe climate. And let me take a spin through what I'll cover today. I'm going to talk about the challenge of reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions and present the perspective of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The timing of this webinar is excellent because, as many of you probably know, the IPCC has just released what's called its Work Group 3 report on mitigation strategies, and I've incorporated that into today's presentation. I'm going to review the 5 key strategies to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions: efficiency, electrification, clean zero carbon electricity, carbon capture, and the reduction of non-CO2 gases. Those are the 5 strategies. I'm going to focus on the first 4, and I'm going to illustrate them with how they were applied in the U.S. long-term strategy released last November, which illustrates that we can do this. We can get to net zero. After that, I'm going to focus on 2 of what I would call the sort of the most debated aspects of those 5 key strategies. One is the clean electricity, asking the question, can we get to 100% renewable electricity? And I'll focus on to do a deep dive on that issue. The second strategy that has controversy is the use of carbon capture, capturing emissions before they leave a smokestack, or capturing emissions literally out of the atmosphere, reducing CO2 concentrations, and storing that CO2 safely. One of the central metaphors for my presentation is we are essentially need to bet on climate solutions. Not all of them will work. Some of them are already ready. Some of them are under development. But I'm going to make the case for spreading our chips as if we were at a casino and making sure that we have lots of options with which to attack this problem. So with that, let me turn to the IPCC. Every roughly 8 years or so, the IPCC issues an assessment report covering the science, Work Group 1, the impacts of climate change, Work Group 2, a mitigation report, Work Group 3, which was just released. And you can also look for a synthesis report of all 3 of these compendiums of scientific information coming this fall. So this mitigation report, which covers, again, how to reduce emissions, how to get on safe pathways, was literally released just Monday. And let's see what it has to tell us about emission pathways that can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or perhaps to 2 degrees. This is one of the key figures from that IPCC report. On the left axis, it shows gigatons of CO2 emissions at a global level, historic levels going back to 2000, and then projections out to 2100, projecting the paths that could keep us to 1.5 degrees warming or 2 degrees warming. So we, like I say, gigatons on the left axis. The world globally emits about 40 gigatons of CO2 each year. On top of that, we also emit other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, and some trace industrial gases. The good news about this figure is that we are no longer on just a constant growth path for CO2 emissions, sort of illustrated in the gray here. Nations have banded together and have begun to implement policies and have started to flatten that curve, as shown in sort of the orange area here that indicates sort of the current policies that countries have pledged to adhere to or have actually enacted, and what it might look like if they did some moderate strengthening of those policies. However, that's not enough. And what the sort of purplish and bluish areas shaded of mitigation pathways shows in the purple what the kind of decreases we would need to be on a path to 2 degrees warming, and in the bluish areas, the paths that would lead us to 1.5 degrees warming. When I say pathways, what I mean in the IPCC context is scientists, economists, other experts from around the world have literally looked at hundreds of modeling exercises to illustrate what it would take to keep warming within those temperature limits. And these shaded areas literally represent kind of the range of the pathways on how we can reduce CO2 emissions. The bottom right there, they've also pulled out what they call an IMP, an illustrative mitigation pathway that sort of shows the flavors of some of these different pathways. One indicating here a gradual strengthening of policies, one that relies on strongly on negative emissions technologies, one that relies on really low energy demand, getting energy demand way down, one that is a very high renewables scenario, and a scenario that strongly integrates sustainable development goals. So these are all pathways that can keep us in an area of like a safe climate, one without excessive warming. Let's take a second look at what these pathways indicate. And I want to illustrate 3 big messages from this IPCC report. The first one is to limit warming to that kind of range, we will have to reach net zero emissions by about 2050 or mid-century. That's for a 1.5 degree goal. If we reach net zero somewhat later in the century, we will probably be more on a path to 2 degrees warming. But either, under any of these pathways, CO2 emissions must start dropping dramatically as soon as possible. We need transformations across all economic sectors: electricity, buildings, transportation, industry, agriculture. If we do this smartly, efficiently, and wisely, the IPCC reports suggest that we could keep the cost of doing this at about 2% of global GDP, maybe less. And that is a very low price to pay, so to speak, to avoid the damages that will come with warming that exceeds 2 degrees, that goes up to 2.5, 3.5 degrees. The damages are just increase exponentially if we miss these warming targets. The third big message is that an overshoot of a 1.5 or 2 degree warming goal is likely. It's going to be hard to bend the emissions curve that quickly. And if we do overshoot, we will need to, in the future, move toward a net negative emissions type of scenario, meaning we will literally have to pull CO2 out of the air in a quantity that exceeds whatever we might still be emitting, and thus sort of cool the Earth back down from an excessive warming. The idea of having negative emissions practices or technologies will also be needed to offset the warming impacts of residual non-CO2 gases, as I mentioned, methane, nitrous oxide, et cetera. Those are very hard to reduce all the way to zero, and so offsetting them is probably going to be highly likely. And just at the bottom here, I'm illustrating the magnitude of that net negative emissions task for later in the century, literally removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either by nature-based means or technological means. I'll return to what the details of what that means later in the presentation. So let's illustrate how can we bend the curve quickly over the next 30 years to get to net zero. As I said at the beginning, there's 5 key strategies. 1, making all of our energy use as efficient as possible across all end uses. 2, electrifying as many end uses as feasible, meaning substituting the direct use of electricity for the combustion of fossil fuels. 3, generating all that electricity, we need to make it clean. We need to make it zero carbon. 4th, capturing carbon either before it goes into the atmosphere or after it goes into the atmosphere, these multiple forms, is a key strategy. And finally, doing everything we can to reduce the non-CO2 gases as well. So how does this play out in what the Biden administration submitted to the Climate Treaty Organization, the UNFCCC? Let's see how they did it, how they plan to do this. Over on the left axis here, we have the net emissions of all greenhouse gases, CO2 equivalent. And the US in 2005 emitted about 6.5 gigatons of all greenhouse gases. In this policy and modeling exercise that the administration conducted, they were able to reduce future emissions out to 2050 by about a gigaton by increasing efficiency across all sectors. Applying the second strategy, electrification, which also includes producing hydrogen from clean electricity or producing other low carbon fuels, they could reduce emissions in 2050 by about 2 gigatons. Applying the third strategy, generating all that electricity in a zero carbon manner, we have many options: renewables, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro. We have nuclear as an option, and the application of carbon capture and storage to the combustion of fossil fuels or biomass. And so again, maybe a gigaton or more of reduction from a base case 2050 scenario through clean electricity. Applying the fourth strategy, carbon capture, we have the application of carbon removal technologies, as well as increasing what's labeled here the land sink, meaning how much is stored in forests and soils, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And finally, some reductions in the non-CO2 gases. This is kind of the central case that the Biden long-term strategy presented last November. They conducted various other pathways and sensitivity analyses, all of which were kind of variations on this theme. So let's take a closer look at what happens in each sector as we apply these strategies. First is in transportation. We can substitute electricity for a lot of use of gasoline and diesel fuel. And electric vehicles, fortunately, are really starting to take off. Right now, here we have exajoules of total transportation energy. And in 2020, not surprisingly, it's almost all fossil. We can take that way down over the next 30 years by substituting electricity, shown in the blue area here, and alternative fuels for the use of fossil fuels in transportation. Our alternative fuels might be hydrogen or biomass. Electricity can, we know it can power most light duty vehicles and medium duty vehicles. We may be using biomass or hydrogen or ammonia in heavy duty transport or aviation or shipping. All of that is within our grasp. We know how to produce these fuels, and with the short capital stock life, particularly of cars and SUVs, we can get on a pretty steep reduction path over the next couple decades. Turning to buildings, again, here we have on the left side exajoules of total energy use in the building sector, commercial, residential. And right now, in 2020, you would not be surprised that we're using fossil and already, of course, use a lot of electricity in our buildings. Some of that electricity is used simply to heat the space, or cook, or dry clothes, or heat water. We can increase the share of that electricity providing all of those end uses in the building sector, and start to decrease the burning of natural gas, the burning of fuel oil to heat our buildings and heat our water. So the decrease here will probably go slower because buildings have a long lifetime. Retrofits can be difficult, but we can certainly begin with new buildings and gradually phase down the use of fossil fuels. The industrial sector is much more complex and will require a multitude of solutions because the industrial sector is so varied in what it does. Again, total energy use in exajoules on the left axis, and not surprisingly, most industrial energy use, of course, is the combustion of fossil fuels, shown here in the gray. We have some end uses already provided by electricity, shown in the green. What this study shows is that we can do a major electrification of end uses shown in the green here, a band, quite wide band of what may be feasible. We can also burn fossil fuels or biomass with carbon capture and storage technology, providing up to perhaps as many as 7 exajoules of energy in 2050. We can begin to deploy hydrogen as a heat source for industrial purposes, anywhere perhaps up to 3 exajoules. But we'll probably have some residual fossil fuel use that will be hard to get rid of. And again, that phenomenon would create the need for some carbon dioxide removal elsewhere in the economy to net out whatever residual emissions still take place. And finally, turning to the electricity sector. The good news here is that we have lots of zero carbon options to choose from. Currently, this sector produces about 4 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity each year. And as we electrify other parts of the economy, that our total generation is going to grow a lot. So it'll be a very important challenge to not only grow generation up to 6 or 11 trillion kilowatt hours by 2050, but also to decarbonize it, to move to zero carbon. Good news here, of course, is that renewables can carry a big load. In this pathway modeled, renewable energy, solar, wind, and also our existing hydro increases by 4 to 7 times and accounts for about 70% of our total electricity supplies in 2050. This is a common conclusion across credible modeling studies. Renewables can provide 60 or all the way up to 90% of total electricity. And this reflects huge and really welcome drops in the cost of solar PV, which has dropped by about 90% in cost over the last 10 years. Big reductions in the cost of wind energy, which has dropped by about 70% over the last 10 years. But it's important to note that in the US long-term strategy, those renewables are complemented by nuclear generation, which produces no CO2 emissions, which they model at either staying stable at about close to 1 trillion kilowatt hours a year, or increasing maybe by as much as 50%. Renewables are also complemented by fossil generation with carbon capture and storage. This is overwhelmingly natural gas burned with capture technology. In this pathway, they provide about 1 to 2 trillion kilowatt hours. And there's even a little bit of gas generation, fossil generation without CCS that, again, fills in key times when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. So this is a typical modeling outcome, but I want to turn now to sort of do a deep dive on the electricity sector and pose a question that maybe many of you ask yourselves. Why doesn't this pathway or the IPCC modeling show 100% renewable electricity down the road? What we see, I've posted a couple of trade press stories here recently, as renewables are winning the economic battle. Solar and wind are so low, they're cheaper than coal or nuclear. Pretty soon they're going to be cheaper than natural gas everywhere. There is good news on this front, as I said. However, the fine print in all of these claims is that claim that renewables are just universally and unquestionably the cheapest power source relies on something called the LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy. which is one metric on looking at power system costs, but it's not the whole story. And I hope to convince you why that's the case. The LCOE, levelized cost of energy, is the average cost of a megawatt hour from a standalone power plant, not connected in any way to a grid, just looking at what that plant puts out. And if we focus only on that, it's actually a misuse of this metric, because what really matters to an economy, what matters to consumers is the system cost, the average cost of the entire power system, all plants and all technologies needed to maintain a reliable grid. And all credible modeling out there indicates that as a power system approaches 100% renewables, that system cost will increase sharply and maintaining reliability will become more difficult. I put this to you as a very widely accepted conclusion. And like I said, the overwhelming number of studies show 60–90% wind and solar by 2050 as achievable. And you have a number of citations there from the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and domestic or national studies such as the Princeton Net Zero America study that came out about a year and a half ago. It's also important to note that nearly all states in the US that have set a goal of zero carbon for the utilities, they define it in terms of 100% clean electricity, not 100% renewables. And even, again, consistent with this, the Biden administration's goal for 2035 is defined as 100% clean electricity, not 100% renewables. Well, why is this? How do these dynamics really play out? Since this is a lot of students, I like to classify this as required reading. If you want to do a deeper dive on this, read a paper called The Challenges of Achieving 100% Renewable Electricity in the US, written by 16 authors that work at the National Renewable Energy Lab, whose mission is to advance renewables. A key quote from this paper that came out last year is that significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% renewables at a national scale for all hours of the year. There's no simple answer to how far we can increase renewable penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. Why is this? As I'm sure you are all familiar with, wind and solar are variable or intermittent sources. They produce only when the sun shines, when the wind blows. There's seasonal patterns to that where it goes up and down. There's a stochastic or random element to when they produce. And so a grid operator must integrate these sources in ways that keep the lights on 24/7. So these integration costs include transmission, building more transmission to aggregate solar and wind over a broader geographic area, storage costs like batteries, pumped hydro, demand management programs, which again are not free, but which can manage load and shift load to when solar and wind are producing. Integration even includes sort of a deliberate overgeneration and spilling of power during certain times when solar and wind are abundant in order to make sure that we have enough solar and wind at periods of lower generation, such for solar in the winter months. How this plays out kind of in a graphic way, this is a graph from that paper that I commend to you that shows on the horizontal axis how the fraction of annual energy from renewables system moves from 0 to 100%, and then a degree of difficulty, a qualitative measure on the vertical axis, cost or difficulty. This is a qualitative figure, but the paper cites the quantitative studies that underlie this. And what the NREL authors tell us is that a short-term variability problem in wind and solar is largely solved. They call this zone 1, reaching from 0 to perhaps 20–40%. We're currently at about 20% renewables in the US, and we can integrate renewables into the system at a fairly low cost with existing dispatchable fossil fuel plants and deploying things like 4-hour duration lithium batteries. As the penetration of renewables increases, this paper talks about the zone 2, what's called the diurnal mismatch problem. Diurnal means just the daily pattern, particularly of solar, where you get perhaps 12 hours of production and 12 hours of no production. The paper talks about this zone is extending up to about 80% renewables, and they say this is very likely going to require storage technologies applied for many, many hours, not just for our lithium batteries, as well as other integration steps that cost money. The final zone, which they describe as zone 3, the seasonal problem, they describe as largely unsolved. As you approach 100% renewables, you're likely going to require low-cost, long-term storage options, and literally days, weeks of stored power, massive transmission builds up, massive deployment of demand response. You also need something to address one of my favorite German words called Dunkelflaute, which translates as the dark doldrums, which means what they observe in Germany and what occurs in any power system is sort of random periods lasting 5, 10, 15 days where solar and wind production plummet because of weather conditions. And so ultimately, a heavy renewable system needs to figure out how to keep the lights on during a Dunkelflaute. So just to close on this key concept, the NREL authors say that we need low and zero carbon options that are firm and dispatchable that can complement renewables. They advocate keeping non-renewable options, including carbon capture and storage and nuclear, available, and arguing that this will enable us to electrify and decarbonize other sectors and reduce our emissions. So they're pointing to the need for roles for our existing nuclear plants, and also developing advanced nuclear designs, perhaps small modular reactors, and also developing fossil options like natural gas with carbon capture and storage, applications such as the alum cycle for natural gas developed by a company called Net Power. If you need further reinforcement on this key aspect of getting to net zero, the new IPCC report has a box in chapter 6 called 100% renewables in net zero energy systems, which makes these same points. So let me turn to the second controversial aspect of getting to net zero, and that is carbon capture. I view the development of carbon capture technology as really an imperative, and that is supported by IPCC and most credible modeling that indicates that we will need this technology to reduce emissions in certain industry applications, and we may need it in the power sector as well. That is capturing CO2 before it ever leaves the smokestack and concentrating it and injecting it underground in permanent geologic formations. As I said earlier in my key message number 3 earlier, we also need to acknowledge a likely overshoot of the 1.5 or 1.2 goals, emitting too much CO2. So we need to pull it back out later in the century. And that takes us into literally pulling out gigatons of CO2 by nature-based or technology means. What do I mean by that? We can envision several ways to reduce carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. One group of measures is called the nature-based measures. And what this means is planting more trees, restoring degraded land, managing our forests better so that they literally pull in and store CO2 literally in their biomass. There are also farming practices that enhance the storage of CO2 in soil, like no-till agriculture. All these practices we know how to do. They are ready now, and they can produce large co-benefits in terms of reducing other types of pollution or fertilizer runoff, providing biodiversity. but we also must acknowledge, particularly in the case of forests, that there is a risk of loss. As temperatures rise, and drought becomes more widespread, of course, we're already seeing more forest fires. We have to be very careful to preserve as much of the stored carbon and not have it go up in smoke. The second category of carbon dioxide removal technologies is technological. Direct air capture on the left here, processing large quantities of air through a chemical procedure, pulling the CO2 out, or growing dedicated crops and combusting them and converting and storing the CO2. Both of these are under development. They are not cheap, and they have certain costs and risks too, but we will very likely need the technological means to supplement the nature-based means, simply because nature-based means cannot get us up to the 5 or 10 or perhaps more billion tons a year we may need. I'm taking a look at the time. I want to save time for Q&A. You should just be aware that a number of environmental NGOs are very opposed to the use of carbon capture in power or in industry or in technological carbon dioxide removal. Of course, many of them are also very opposed to nuclear power. So this is something I'm sure you're aware of and remains a debate. So I'll just close by saying that we our sense need to bet on climate solutions, and we can place all of our chips on a pure renewables scenario and a pure nature-based carbon dioxide removal pathways, or we can spread our chips on a broader portfolio. In my view, we definitely need to spread those chips on a broader portfolio to ensure that we can maintain a safe climate. I'll stop here and very happy to take some questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. We have several questions in the chat, and so if everyone would love to stick around and listen to them, that would be wonderful. I'm just going to go in the order they were raised, so it progresses linearly through the presentation. But my question was actually first, and it was, what's the difficulty with the integration costs for the system of renewable energy when the system looks to approach 100% renewable energy? You said it gets sharper and it gets more difficult to achieve cost-wise.
Mm-hmm. It will depend, where that point is hit depends in part on the particular country circumstances, the grid circumstances, and the resource mix of that country. As some of you may know, there are some countries that are nearly 100% renewable, but that's because they have huge hydro systems. Costa Rica, Norway. A typical country right now is very dependent on fossil fuels. Some countries have a lot of solar, some don't. Some have a lot of wind, some don't. But typical country, as it gets up to 60, 70, 80% renewables, those integration costs will start to increase very rapidly. And individual studies can illustrate sort of the components of how that happens. But it's a general and widely accepted phenomenon.
Awesome, thank you very much. And our next question came from Stephen, and I see you have your camera on. If you'd like to ask it yourself, you're more than welcome.
Sure, thanks, Hadley. Hey all, appreciate that presentation, Dr. Husker, very informative. Thank you so much. So my question was regarding, you had touched on it, right? The integration costs of renewables as we try to clean the grid. The transmission corridors I know has been coming up more and more, I think, in the news recently. And my question actually touched on one that was regional, which is in New York, right? They're having some troubles actually against, I think there's a lot of environmental groups against the corridor that they've been planning for some time now to bring clean energy from Canada. It's particularly hydro, right, energy down to New York City. So I'm wondering, as far as from the federal level, like infrastructure bill, et cetera, have there been some moves, maybe perhaps from with the infrastructure bill on the transmission corridor debate, and or has it highlighted the need or the lack of transmission corridors across the country?
Thanks for this question, Stephen. This is a really important issue. Number one, the infrastructure bill, I do not believe has strong provisions on trying to increase transmission. Number of experts and stakeholders and advocates have been trying to make the building of transmission lines easier over the years and have made very slow progress. At the federal level, the FERC can streamline the construction of natural gas pipelines, but has no similar parallel authority to streamline the construction of transmission lines. And you touched on a key issue and a key conundrum, I believe, for environmental advocates. There have been attempts to increase the import of zero carbon hydropower, which is abundant in Canada, bring it to New York. There's also recently a referendum in Maine to try to bring hydro in from Maine, and the Maine voters rejected it. And this indicates a stark trade-off between trying to preserve a safe climate and whatever the perceived problems are with transmission lines. A lot of research over the years have shown that there are visual impacts from building a transmission line, yes, but there are really negligible health or environmental impacts from transmission. And if we're going to get serious about climate change, we're going to have to find ways to build a lot more transmission lines to bring solar, wind, hydro from often remote areas into our load centers.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that question, Stephen. And I believe you may have had one later, or you had another comment. But the next question comes from Katrina Klausing from Cal Poly. We have two Katrinas here, and I know her. She's one of our ambassadors, and she goes by Katie. Wonderful to have you here. And her question was, what is the short-term variability problem?
Short-term variability problem that we are easily solving now is simply just hour-to-hour fluctuation in wind generation or solar generation. And it can just fluctuate hour to hour with the cloudiness in an area, and wind especially just can fluctuate a lot day to day. And so when it goes down, we need power sources that can just instantly step in. And batteries are very good at that. But also fossil fuel plants, particularly gas power plants, output can be turned up and down quickly. So we are easily addressing that short-term variability problem now. But then as the percentage gets higher, then we have to think about, okay, every night we have zero solar output. Okay, what do we do? Okay, we're working on that problem. And then then we get to seasonal variation and random incidents like Dunkelflaute.
Amazing, thank you. And then I know we have two questions from Andrea, and I believe I saw in the chat that you're from Cornell, so thank you for joining us here today. If you'd like to ask your questions yourself, since you're on camera, that would be wonderful. Or I can go in and ask them for you in case you have them all in the chat.
I mean, I don't mind. Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Klauser. I really appreciated that. I was wondering if you could please clarify the integration of renewables in the grid. I don't really see why it is that the integration of renewables calls for batteries as opposed to the integration of, I mean, so far we have worked with fossil fuels and technology advancement in that field hasn't been necessary. So if you could please clarify that, that would be really good.
Yeah, first of all, go Big Red. Hello, fellow Cornellian. That was my undergraduate degree was from Cornell. The variability of renewable energy is just literally a physical phenomenon. So let's say we had no clouds on a summer day. Your solar plant is going to start producing about 7 a.m. and it's going to ramp up its production as the sun gets to till noon. It's going to have maximum output, and then it's going to start going downhill 4, 5, 6 p.m. and then it's out. That is completely unlike a fossil fuel plant or a hydro plant, where the water keeps flowing, we keep burning fossil fuels, and a nuclear plant just keeps running, except, occasionally, yeah, they will go offline. There will be a mechanical failure of some kind. Similarly, the wind output from a windmill is completely dependent on the speed of the wind. It produces a certain amount of electricity at a 5-mile-an-hour wind, produces a lot more at a 30-mile-an-hour wind. But that wind speed at any place in the country is going to fluctuate all day, and sometimes, often, actually hit zero. One way to think about this is the capacity factor of a power plant. What percentage of the total time does it produce output? Wind and solar capacity factors are all under 40%, 20, 30, 40%, depending on location, whereas the capacity factor of a fossil fuel plant or nuclear plant is under the control of the operator and can exceed 90%. So that's the variability. That's why when you have a whole collection of solar and wind plants giving different output, you need to somehow integrate them so they produce as much electricity as consumers are demanding at every hour of the day. Is that helpful?
It was. I think I'm personally missing the reason why the fact that all the renewable, the energy produced by renewables is integrated into the grid, why that doesn't make things even out.
Mm-hmm. When you average the production of solar or wind over a bigger and bigger geographic area, the fluctuations will reduce in magnitude. However, we still have the nighttime phenomenon. Solar goes to zero. You'll have predictable patterns in wind. Again, this varies across the country, but I'm most familiar with California, I think, where they get not too much wind production in the morning. In the middle of the day, it really tends to pick up in the evening and on into the night. And even when you average over a bigger and bigger geographic area, it doesn't make the problem go away. It just reduces it, which is why building transmission is one integration strategy.
Thank you. That really clarifies it. Another question that I had parallel to that is if you could please elaborate on the farming practices that you commented on, the ones that are sustainable.
Yeah, my knowledge here is not very, very deep, but I'll tell you what I do know off the top of my head. Certain kinds of plants and plants in general store carbon in the soil, and the more that you plow a field every year, the more of that soil carbon you lose. So one strategy that enhances soil sequestration of carbon is to go to no tillage, not plowing your fields every year, and that will enhance soil carbon. Also, if we move to more perennial plants that instead of annual plants that create deeper and larger root systems maintained year by year, that will also store more carbon in the soil, actually in the biomass of the agricultural plant. There may be other aspects, but I'm just not an expert in soil carbon. Those are two examples.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And lastly, I was wondering if you could please also elaborate on one of the topics that you mentioned earlier, which was the electrification of the transportation system. I'm wondering what the cost benefit analysis is of sourcing materials from to renovate the transportation system of the entire country. That is one of the concerns I have, and I was wondering if you had any insight on that.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, did you say sort of the cost benefit or the life cycle costs, or? Yeah,
an analysis of what the benefit is to renovate the vehicles to cover transportation system for the entire country, in an attempt to electrify the transportation system.
Right. I don't have sort of gross aggregate numbers at the tip of my tongue, but I can say that with the drop in cost of electric vehicles, and particularly driven by big drops in the cost of the lithium batteries. We're now to the point where on a life cycle basis, the cost of an electric vehicle over its lifetime is now the same or dropping below the cost of a gasoline powered vehicle. And that is partly because electricity is a cheaper fuel than gasoline, also driven by the fact that electric cars have fewer moving parts, and the maintenance, we expect the maintenance bills on electric vehicles to be less than their gasoline counterparts. So there are upfront investment costs. An electric vehicle initial purchase cost is still higher than a gasoline vehicle, but the costs are coming down, and on a life cycle basis, it's crossing over. So this will be have a positive benefit cost ratio going forward.
Thank you for that. I apologize if I wasn't clear. I meant the cost as in like the environmental impact of sourcing these materials. I don't know if that makes any difference.
The environmental impacts of, say, of mining lithium or other thing. Okay.
Demand like that.
Yeah. I don't have a comprehensive any comprehensive knowledge on the different life cycle environmental costs, but in a broad brush strokes, we certainly know that the use of coal, oil, natural gas has the mother of all environmental externalities, which is the emission of CO2. We're trying to get rid of that. We also know that the use of burning of fossil fuels creates tremendous local air pollution problems in terms of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. And we also know that the mining and extraction of fossil fuels also carries tremendous environmental burdens, particularly for the locally affected communities. As we move to a clean energy system, yes, there will be environmental impacts with the materials we need for that clean energy system. Building a windmill takes a lot of aluminum, so we'll still be mining bauxite, we'll still be laying cement, we'll still be making steel, we'll be making a ton of glass for our solar panels, we'll be mining a lot of lithium and various rare earth metals. So yes, we need to manage all of those environmental impacts and keep them as low as possible. However, you can't make them go away. Overall, I think it is the right trade-off to make in order to stop a planet from warming even further than what it already has.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
You bet.
Thank you for all those questions, Andrea. And I think that was a really good just elaboration on all these different subjects. We just have about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure we can answer as many questions as possible. So I will ask them on behalf of you all, and then Dr. Hasker, if you could keep your answers to about 45 seconds just to see if we can get through them, and then have about 1 minute for announcements at the end, that would be great. Our next question comes from Katrina S. from Vermont Law School, and her question is what we can do to mitigate the negative effects of clean energy. For example, she supports hydro, but dams are causing issues. For example, Seattle has experienced a dramatic drop in salmon populations due to hydroelectric power.
Yes, hydro is an interesting angle here. Certainly in the US, we've already tapped into the best hydro sites. And a further expansion of hydro is unlikely within the United States. And you're also right, it has what we have done has done terrible damage to salmon runs. And in fact, sometimes we're actually taking dams down now to improve salmon habitat. There is a lot of untapped hydro around the world. And certainly, as we said, Canada has plenty to export to us. But in every case where we're doing new hydro, one needs to take a hard look at what are the local environmental impacts, and is it worth it to expand or build new dams?
Definitely, thank you. And then our next question is from Brett. He asked if you could talk about the role of DERs.
Mm-hmm. Distributed energy resources, I believe, by saying DER. DER is a term that encompasses rooftop solar, distributed small scale, along with other practices like energy storage batteries at the household level, and also demand management strategies that at a small scale level. They are all part of the solution, and the electricity pathways that I presented both at national level and certainly at the global level modeling, there's always some incorporation of DERs. They are promising, they are not the full answer, but they are part of the solution.
Perfect. And very quickly, Carl, would you be able to stay a few minutes after as needed to answer some questions?
Let me answer that in two ways. No, let me answer that in one. Yes, I'm very happy to go past the top of the hour.
Okay, perfect.
And I should also mention I'm going to be sharing with Hadley and Michelle the deck that I used today. It has many links to the studies I've cited, and feel free to do deeper dives, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
And I just want to say, I know that we're just right before the end of the official meeting time slot. So if you have to go, we wanted to just say thank you so very much for attending today. I just noticed that we did not lose anybody hardly at all through this presentation. It's really heavy information, but yet everyone was super engaged, has been asking so many questions, still is asking questions.
Yeah.
And so this has been just, I think Dr. Husker has been just the most perfect speaker for this first series. So I want to say thank you to everyone for coming. And any other announcements, Hadley, before we continue the discussion?
Yes,
And
very excited to hear. Yeah, I'm very excited to hear from everyone's other questions, but just very quickly, thank you again for coming to this. This is the first session of our University Climate Ambassador Educational Series. Again, this is put on behalf of the University Climate Ambassador Program at the Global Climate Pledge under the U.S. Green Chamber of Commerce. And our goal is to get as many students as possible engaged in taking climate action by collaboratively working to implement sustainable initiatives on campus, while also fostering students' environmental leadership skills and just increasing all of your knowledge on these issues through events like this. So we hope to see you more in the future. If you'd like to learn more about the program, I've included the link in the chat. If you'd like to apply as a student ambassador, I've included that link as well. And I have my email there as well. And if you are a faculty member or industry professional, please reach out to me via email if you'd like to learn more about how to get involved. And I will always be available to answer any questions, so my email is there. And for those who have to leave, thank you again for your time, but let's get into the other questions.
And maybe because we do have a little bit more time, if you are here and you want to ask your own question, yes, feel free. If you don't, let us know.
Yeah. The next one we had was from Ethan from Stevens, if you're still here and would like to ask it yourself. Let's see. I see that he's here, but for the time being, there we go.
Was that my name? Sorry, I do have to run, but thank you all. Michelle, great to see you. And thanks, Hadley.
Stephen.
Bye all.
Thanks.
Appreciate your presentation again, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
The question was from Ethan from Stevens. And so Stephen did jump in there because he heard his name. But in case Ethan is not unmute, his question was, for places where no form of renewables or other clean energy sources are viable at the moment, would better energy transportation be a better option, bringing energy from areas where energy can be produced cleanly?
This is a great question, and I'm glad it's asked because it's an angle that I did not have time to touch on. Let's talk about energy resources, even in a very current events context. Not all countries are as blessed as the United States. We've had abundant fossil fuel resources our entire history. We have domestic uranium. We have rich solar resources, rich wind resources, both onshore and offshore, because we have huge coastlines. We have huge amounts of farmland and land in general to grow forests, to grow food, to grow biomass crops. Not every country is as rich in resources we are. And let's zoom in on Ukraine and Europe right now. There's not only a climate aspect to this, there's an energy security aspect to this. Many countries in Europe made a deliberate choice to rely heavily on Russian natural gas exports. They unfortunately, they thought that was going to build ties that would decrease the chance of hostilities. And look at what has happened, where Russia is using, this is not the first time Russia has used natural gas as a weapon to try to influence other countries' behavior. That said, that's just another facet of the fact that there are many countries that are not going to have the solar resources, the wind resources, the hydro resources, or the biomass resources that the US has. They're not going to have the hydro that Norway has. They're not going to have the huge biomass that Brazil uses to create huge amounts of liquid fuel. And this is another reason why I say, as a globe, as a civilization, we need to create lots of options. And there may be a country that is going to have to lean more heavily on nuclear power to not only keep the lights on, but to create some level of energy security, so it's not importing a ton from elsewhere. There may be a country that does not have the rich solar and wind, so it's never going to get to 80% renewable. It's going to get to 30% or 50%. Those circumstances are going to vary a lot. Can we transport energy? You said, can those countries rely on energy transportation? Yeah, in a sense, we do have global energy markets. As you know, we have the natural gas pipelines that I just alluded to. We have oil tankers crisscrossing, and sometimes we have electricity transmission lines that cross borders. And and in a heavily electrified world, which is what a net zero world looks like, I would certainly hope and pray that we have a lot of electricity transmission lines crossing borders in areas that have been relatively free of hostilities. And yet, even if we can get close to that future, every country is going to have to also make a decision to what extent do they want to rely on that transmission line as basically just kind of a lifeline for their country's economy, or literally to keep their citizens warm in the winter, versus generating some fraction of their clean energy within their borders. So that will be sort of a brave new world we'll move into in the future, where again, electricity becomes even more essential than it is right now.
Amazing. Thank you. And we actually have many more questions, and Ethan says thank you in the chat. I think we're going to have to end this in 5 to 10 minutes. So I'm going to prioritize the questions of the people who are still here, because 2 people unfortunately had to leave. I believe Brett was next in that regard, if you'd like to ask it yourself, Brett.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thanks so much for everything, really. What was that question I was asking? Oh yeah, just I'm just like trying to look at like so-called low-hanging fruit here. I'm just wondering if, in your opinion, right now, just what the political situation is in the Senate, and just basically just because of that, if it makes more sense to basically fund the decarbonization of grids in other countries where it might be cheaper and you might not have to. I don't know. I just don't think Joe Manchin would care so much about it. It's not his market.
That's an interesting question, laced with politics. One thing you're touching on is the importance of countries like the U.S. Assisting other countries in getting onto a lower carbon development path. If we could wave a magic wand and completely eliminate U.S. emissions, and let's wave another magic wand and completely reduce, take to zero emissions from the EU, Canada, Australia, Japan, we would still have a huge problem. And a lot of the emissions growth over the next 30 years is projected to come from developing countries. Not that's because they're bad or dirty, but because they're growing and trying to deliver higher standards of living, 24/7 access to electricity to a couple billion people. So yes, the U.S. has, I think, for 30 years has had some assistance programs along that line, and we work also with other industrialized countries to try to spur renewable growth in other countries, energy efficiency, et cetera. Whether sort of climate hawks should focus more on that versus our domestic policies, I can't really say. I'd like to think we should walk and chew gum at the same time. We also have not talked about state level action. And again, it's fortunate that many states are moving forward with decarbonizing their economies, even as federal policy, is just on a pendulum swing depending on who's in power. But I would urge us to continue to work this at all levels: international, national, state, local, and right down to your college's sustainability plan.
I totally get what you're saying. I'm just wondering, just from like a policy standpoint of like what the president could do during his time in office. And the Senate is so stuck right now, and it's so discouraging to see that. And I just wonder, I'm just wondering if people are looking to that as kind of like a climate solution right now. Just as you said, all these countries are about to come online like they never would before. And we could really use some good diplomacy right now. Yeah,
absolutely. I think the unfortunate truth is that appropriations still must pass the Senate and pass the House. And so in terms of money, the Biden administration will be constrained by what it can pass in terms of appropriation bills. There's always a level of technical assistance to these countries that can be done at relatively cheap cost, but that's advice, training, and information. One thing, if you want to dive deeper into this, if you go to the IPCC report, there are chapters on climate finance, sort of a buzzword for how the financial flows, both private investment and government assistance that are flowing but should flow in greater amounts to the developing countries in the coming years.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Amazing. Thank you for your questions, Brett. And we have 2 more left from the people in attendance. Katrina from Vermont Law School, if you'd like to ask it, that would be wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So I was in Guatemala back in 2017, and obviously one of the biggest issues there was the lack of funding for much, and then also just the government wasn't interested in pursuing any kind of regulation. So I guess globally, like, what can we do in situations like that? Because I personally saw this isn't one of them isn't climate change related. It's more just like water. There's a lot of water contamination because mining was happening near the lakes. So you were getting heavy metals in the lakes, and you were also getting nutrient pollution because there was no plumbing and there was nowhere for the runoff to go to. But as far as the greenhouse gases go, we went to like wastewater treatment plants, and without funding, like, things would break there and they wouldn't be able to get fixed. So they would just keep operating. So for example, the capture of like methane for the solid waste portion of the wastewater treatment plants wasn't being captured. And there's also no regulation to turn the plant off, but also if you did, you wouldn't have a way to clean the water. So it was just kind of like one big mess. So what can we do to, I don't know, globally, like, help that situation, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You are fortunate to have had that kind of experience living overseas. I lived for a year in India and was able to observe some of the same things or analogous things that you just described. What your story recounts or drives home for all of us is people in developing countries have a lot more things on their mind than climate change. Basic sanitation, basic power supplies, basic educational goals, and sometimes just enough food to eat. We have violence rampant in the Central American countries, and you have bribery and corruption. What this points to is the need for again, the richer industrialized countries to help countries like Guatemala on all of the what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that the United Nations has set forth. And often, not always, but often, the solutions or the pursuit of a sustainable development goal will also lower greenhouse gas emissions. So they're often in concert, but not always. And if we can increase electricity access through the use of wind and solar and batteries, good, they're aligned. If a developing country says, I don't need that, I don't want that, I want to burn coal or natural gas, then you know, who are we to say, no, we're not going to let you burn natural gas for electricity. And we will have to help them at some stage in development to move to a cleaner economy.
Thank you for that. That's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina, and thank you, Carl. And then our last question for the day comes from Andrea again.
Thank you. Because my initial question has been kind of answered right now, I would like to add a secondary question, which is what would the role be of private institutions to kind of like have an impact in this field, especially when we consider DERs and the electrification of different projects. I wonder, companies, for example, Tesla, who is like doing a lot of development in this field, how much can the government split in attaining a goal between policy work and actual, you know, driving change through incentivizing private institutions to pursue those goals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we absolutely sort of need all of the above. There are things that government can sort of do on its own. There are things where government needs to regulate or incentivize private business behavior, and the incentives can be taxes for something we have too much of. It can be subsidies for things we want more of, and all that policy design is all going to, of course, vary with the problem, with the industry we're dealing with, et cetera. But I think you may also be putting your finger on purely voluntary action. I'm encouraged that businesses both in the US and globally are starting to take, I think, more concrete steps toward reducing greenhouse gases, even in the absence of policy. And organizations, of course, like the Green Chamber of Commerce, thank you, Michelle, are critical in catalyzing more behavior like this. In my discussions with senior people in the business community, they realize that particularly at the federal level in the US, policy has been often frozen or wildly fluctuating, and that they know, they see what's happening. They want to leave a better planet for their children, and more business people are saying, okay, what can we do? They can't commit suicide. They can't, for their business. They can't do things that are so crazy or costly as to just tank their business. No, but they're looking for creative and cost-effective ways to reduce their emissions. So we need to spur more of that, and we need to make sure that more and more companies and individuals take the global climate pledge.
Thank you. And if you allow me to ask, and I apologize, this will be the last question. Before we touched briefly upon the topic of prioritizing one, I guess, environmental degradation topic as like over another. Briefly, we commented on the fact that we would like CO2 emissions to be driven down, when we were comparing it to the sourcing of minerals to produce ion batteries. I wonder what the impact of, for example, and touching on this policy issue, the lobbies that would contribute to probably like having an impactful change in the agriculture industry or other industries. I guess like what would the priority of the state be as of right now? And what is like the goal that we would want to attain in order to have the most impact?
I need you to replay that a little bit. What the goal of a state, meaning like a state within in the United States, or a state and nation in general? And I guess we can run that question by me one more time. I didn't quite follow it.
Yeah, sorry. I guess in the topic of the United States, how do we decide between the many different environmental degradation problems that we have right now? And I guess like what would the best strategy be in order to I guess like the role of the different lobbies that there are right now, because they're so intertwined, where could the governmental action be better placed? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. In a sense, it's funny. It's so hard to set priorities in a sense because we have wasted so much time that we sort of need to move on everything on all fronts. You turn the clock back to the 1990s and sort of the debate among climate policymakers were like, where's the low-hanging fruit? What should we do first? What should we do second? There's a cost curve of emission reductions. Let's start at the low end of the curve and move up gradually, blah, blah, blah. And the fact that we have wasted a couple of decades barely bending the emissions curves, and now we're looking at necessity for steep cuts, means it's hard to say, we should really be doing A instead of B. But even given that, I think we can still have a sense of priorities in terms of what can be done quickest, where do we have the most momentum and at the least cost. And I think that means eliminating carbon emissions from the power sector as quickly as possible this decade. We have the technologies mostly at hand for steep reductions. And also in vehicles, if we can make a big push on electric vehicles, that will have a fast impact. As I alluded to, both in buildings and in industry, the natural capital stock turnover is much slower. And so, yeah, eventually we'll probably have to do some retrofits, but if we can get that, if we can do a lot of things just kind of on the natural capital stock turnover cycle, it'll be less painful, and we'll make progress in the 2030s, 2040s, and beyond. I hope that's helpful.
It was. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Hausker, and thank you, Andrea, for all of your questions. They're such good ones, and I'm glad to see that the Cornell alum and the Cornell student can connect on all of this. But all in all, thank you all for such a wonderful call. It's been amazing to see all of your questions, more than I could have ever imagined, but also very insightful. And thank you, Dr. Hausker, for giving all of these wonderful answers and taking this time to go over and spend this time with us today as a whole. And it's so exciting to see so many people stick around so long after the call. So we really appreciate all of your engagement with this.
It's been a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to field questions from clearly a very smart, informed, and caring crowd. Thank you.
Yes, truly. Thank you
very
all.
much so. Oh, and also, if you want to be informed of upcoming events, please go to the, start following the University Climate Ambassadors on LinkedIn, as well as Instagram and other areas, and definitely reach out to Hadley. And hopefully you can also, if you would like, apply to become a University Climate Ambassador. But thank you again, Dr. Carl Husker, and everyone for your, as Dr. Carl Husker said, very informed questions. We were actually kind of worried that we would just have to come up with questions because it would be so complex that it was going to be, maybe just a little bit too much, but obviously that was not the case. So really enjoy everyone, and thank you again, and have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.